Welcome to our lecture on the nature of the state. This is a fundamental issue that is often neglected in courses on American government and really in political science. If we want to really understand American political institutions and American politics, we have to look at some foundational issues related to how the state came into being. One assumption that is often made and in the minds of most political scientists, irrefutable. It's both a normative and an empirical observation based upon our earlier discussions, is that the state is an inevitability. Now, the opposite of a state, a environment, a country, a world without a state, we would call anarchy. But even anarchy itself is a type of state in many estimations, although it's really defined as the lack of order, chaos. For example, when I was in college, back in the dark, misty recesses of history, there was a rock group, if one can even call it a rock group, in England by the name of Sex Pistols. Some of you may have heard of them. They had one of the great anarchic or pro-anarchy songs and sentiments ever expressed, at least in my lifetime, and perhaps yours as well. They had a song whose the lyrics were something of this sort: God save the Queen and her fascist regime, Shan, Hill, and Bane. Basically against the Queen, against any kind of political order in England, or against any political order altogether. The problem with anarchy, which is the opposite of an organized political collective that we call the state, is that it tends not to last so very long. Most of us, in fact, never experience anarchy in our lifetimes because it's usually both, while initially exhilarating, it's ultimately painful, and it may result in our death. And anarchy certainly does not contribute to a stable political order. There are many political thinkers, or at least a few, who have recommended anarchy. Sometimes those who criticize the state as it is, especially those who are the most extreme critics of the state, will argue that anarchy is the way to go. But in terms of a political reality, it's very hard to sustain anarchy, because if there is a vacuum in political power, that vacuum is usually replaced by some leader, some state, or a combination thereof. It used to be thought that there were areas beyond the organization of a state as well, but that has tended not to be true, because in the 21st century, almost every possible available space is claimed. I used to joke that nobody wants Antarctica, but Antarctica is even claimed to a degree, although we don't really consider that valuable for any kind of agricultural use. But someday there may be a serious dispute over the mineral rights of Antarctica, and perhaps some other areas of the world. But there are a great deal of disputes over where a state begins and where it ends. And we have various disputes in the world today. What we're going to do in the course of this lecture is look at the more developed and more comprehensive ideas of the state, not so much about anarchy, certainly not about the Sex Pistols or Elvis or anyone else, and their philosophies, but look at the major thinkers about the state, the major views of the state. We have to look not just at what happened before us. As you know from the previous lecture, I suggested that history was a dead subject. At least that's my joke to the historians. What we want to look at is also some contemporary conflicts related to how the state has evolved and what the nature of the state is. To begin that, we have to go way back, way back. We have to go really to the ancient world, to 4th century Athens. And Alfred North Whitehead, the great Harvard philosopher, once noted that all disputes began and were most adequately commented upon by Plato and Aristotle. the two great Greek political thinkers. And so we begin with the Hellenic world, the Greek world, 4th century BC. And we begin with the great Greek political thinker, Plato. Plato thought the state was the perfect representation of justice. His classic work, although he's the author of many works, his classic work is The Republic. This is his most important work on the nature of the state, and I would encourage you to, when you have an opportunity, to read this work. It's one of the great works of world civilization, of Western civilization. But Plato argues that for the state to be just, most just, it had to have the highest level of human reasoning. People have to think clearly and have to be guided and have to be part of a learning community. Also, Plato believed that everyone had a role. In fact, he divided society into three parts. There's the three natural divisions of society. The most interesting and perhaps bewildering part of that natural division of society was the ruling class that he called the guardians. There are many unusual aspects, but they were the ones that were the most just. They lived together. They never married, but they did produce offspring. And they were the sort of philosophical rulers. These are the people who had the most developed sense of reasoning and the most developed intellects. He also had two other categories that people would fall in. This was a natural evolution. There was a sort of middle class, basically sort of military related, that would protect the country. And then there was a class where most people would find themselves, we call the producers, people who did most of the work for the regime. Now, one thing to keep in mind is Plato's guardian class was not just some sort of elevated system for defending aristocracy. These were the people who gave their lives to running the state and running the country. And that they were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do. And this is a very powerful argument about a natural aristocracy, a regime based upon justice, and a very convincing argument as well. But keep in mind that both with Plato and in a moment we're going to talk about Aristotle, their idea of the state was very small. It was what was called the polis. It was actually probably 5,000 people. So their idea would be not all that different from our campus community. A very small world in a political sense, but the polis was sort of the genius of the Greek political system. And it was very small, very different from a country like the United States with 300 million people, and very complex rules, very complex government, very complex obligations of the citizen. So you have Plato and the idea of the just state, the guardian class. Plato is followed by his student Aristotle, the other great Greek political theorist. Aristotle is actually Plato's student, as Plato had been Socrates' student. Now, in Plato's case, we talk about him as sort of the father of normative political thought. We talked about Aristotle as the father of empirical thought. Aristotle approached politics and society and government in a very different way. His approach was much more systematic. In fact, his great work on the politics and government is called Aristotle's The Politics. And this is a book, again, like Plato's Republic, I would encourage you to read. It's part of being an educated citizen, an educated student of politics and society. And it's a very readable work. It's a study and a systematic one of 158 constitutions of the ancient world to see what worked best and what could be used to better the Athenian polis. And it's an amazing study. In many ways, Aristotle is the father of political science, because this is what political scientists do. They try to see how to improve the regime, what works best, what doesn't, because a lot of things don't work very well. So Aristotle gives us that view as well. Um, like Plato, and they have a lot in common, they have some areas of disagreement as well. And if you have the opportunity to take additional courses in political science, especially in political theory, you'll have the opportunity to explore this very rich areas of agreement and disagreement that are still valid today. Politics is the master science, and as the godfather of empirical political science, Plato says we have to look at all the available data and make the best decision about the state. Like Plato, Aristotle views the polis as the center of all that is good and worthwhile. Unlike Plato, Aristotle does not have this division of society. He thinks everyone has their place in politics and society. And somewhat different from Plato, he believes that government is best conducted where the folks are closest to the action that is being taken. Now let's unpack that for a moment. What does he mean by that? He means that government that is closest to the people is best. There's an idea, a fancy word that, again, you can use to win friends and influence people, called subsidiarity. And subsidiarity is the idea that government should take place, or at least be centered closest to the activity. And that means local. And Aristotle uses the metaphor of the family in his book, The Politics, to describe this and to discuss this. And which is a very powerful metaphor for us to consider. This is a Hellenic or Greek contribution to the nature of the state. The Greeks are followed, of course, by the great Roman civilization. Now, Rome adopts many of the insights of Greece when Greece falls and Athens falls, and they adopt many of those insights and update them, and they have a very different view of politics. It's in the view of the polis, very small. We have, with Rome, the notion of an empire. Also, in the Roman model, there's a greater concentration upon legal thought. The gift of a constitution really comes, constitutio in Latin, comes to us from Roman political thought. The most significant figure in terms of influence on America and American Constitution is the great Roman jurist, lawyer, Cicero. And he wrote a very famous book on the nature of the state. Keep in mind that he was incredibly influenced by Plato. So it is no mistake that his great work on the state is called The Republic, just like Plato's Republic. And in this book, The Republic, or De Republica, he surveys what is the best state. He also wrote a book called On Duties, which is a fascinating role, sort of the ethical role of the citizen and of the individual. Sometimes Cicero is associated with the so-called Stoic school of philosophy. Now, Rome, of course, had a very elevated system of laws and a constitution, various constitutions. So again, these contribute to our idea of the state, what is necessary. A constitution is good. Sort of moral quality of the citizen is related to the welfare of the state. Many of these insights are still very important to American political thought, American political life, and American views of government. Greece, Rome, the fall of Rome, we have the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, the church was the dominant institution. The church, in some roles, and in some cases, selected the political leadership for the country. So this is very, very important. The church's view over time, and again, in this case, we're talking mainly about the Christian church, the Holy Catholic Church, is that human beings were prone to do bad things. They were prone to do bad things because of their innate sinfulness. And this was in accord with the Roman notion of a constitution, that you'd have a framework for society and politics. And in the Middle Ages, you have the growth of law, and especially as related to the church, which is called canon law, church law on one hand. On the other hand, you have the law of individuals, and the law of politics, the law of society we call civil law. So you have the growth of both and the interrelatedness of both of those. The most important figure in that Middle Ages, in the period of the Middle Ages, is St. Augustine from North Africa, who believed that government should be limited by its contract with the citizen and its contract with God. So the power of the state was not omnipotent, and by that we mean in total control. There were necessary limitations on the state. And this was, for hundreds of years, the prevailing view of politics and society. The power of the church begins to dissipate over time in terms of shaping the notion of politics and society. And we have sort of the rise of what was often called modern philosophical ideas of the state and then the nature of the state. And that's what we want to transition to now, are those modern ideas. These are ideas as the church, in the Middle Ages, the church began to lose its power and its influence. These new ideas evolve. Now, most of these new ideas of what we call modern philosophical theories of the nature of the state tended, instead of looking universal, like Plato, Aristotle, Rome, Cicero, the Middle Ages, they tend to look more nationalistic in their focus of particular countries. We have in the after the Middle Ages and the early modern era, the development of different notions of sovereignty. Now that is, again, one of those fancy, highfalutin words that you can use to win friends and influence people. Sovereignty means where ultimate power resides. And that's a fundamental question in American politics, in world politics, and in almost all concerns. The term sovereignty arose in a theological sense when people talked about, theologians in the Middle Ages started talking about the sovereignty of God. But it quickly is applied to politics. And in the modern era, in the early modern era, it begins to be used by students of politics to look at the nature of the state and the power of the state. Instead of viewing the state as a natural, organic creation, we begin to have new theories of how the citizen becomes part of the state. Instead of Plato and Aristotle and really the ancient medieval period that we were naturally part of the state, you have the rise of individualism more generally, the notion that individuals have an agreement, a contract with the state. And so we have the rise of social contracts, social contract theories of the nature of the state. Probably the most dramatic and challenging is the German philosopher Hegel, who saw the state as really the ultimate perfection of rationality. Now, most are not going to agree with that, so we need to unpack those early modern and the modern views of the nature of the state. The first very important thinker is Jean Bodin, who lived from 1530 to 1596. He is usually credited by political scientists with asserting this idea of sovereignty, that all authority has to rest somewhere, and the natural place for it to rest is in the state. And so each state, and you can have the creation of multiple states within a world political system. And he spends a great deal of time explaining the nature of the state, how it is to function, how is sovereignty transferred, all these kinds of things. He is followed by the great English political thinker Thomas Hobbes, who lives from 1588 to 1679. Hobbes had a very low view of human nature, very much like politics and theories of the state in the Middle Ages. In fact, he thought in our native state that we are nasty, brutish, short, and some other characteristics. But that'll give you some idea. And that we were, if left alone in what he viewed was our state of nature, what we naturally are, that we'd probably kill each other. And so we come together, we move from a state of nature to form a social contract, basically to keep ourselves from killing each other. Because most of us are going to die, according to Hobbes, because of the violent death that will come from us in our state of nature, because we're, as that famous rock song says, which fortunately Hobbes did not have a chance to listen to, we're bad to the bone. And without a social contract to move us from that state of nature to a political system, to a state, it was a war of all against all. And it's going to be bad. And we're going to die. So we come together to survive. Once we enter into that state, this is his theory of the state. Once you enter into it, you're there forever, for the most part. There's an exception or two, but not many. The only time we have a need or a right to rebel is if our life is threatened by the state itself, but that's not going to happen. Also, we'll have a leader that will arise, and this person, the sovereign, will protect and represent all of our interests. Now, it is not a mistake to keep in mind that Hobbes is writing during a period of time where the monarchy, especially in England, is under serious assault and need for reform. And you can guess which side Hobbes is on, if he's a defender of the sovereign, and the sovereign being able to look after our interests with great ability. In terms of theories of the state, Hobbes is followed by the second great social contract theory, John Locke, out there from 1632 to 1704. Locke, like Hobbes, is a social contract theorist, but a very different kind of theorist. In fact, Locke is seen as one of the most influential figures on the creation of the American regime. Now, in my view, and in my writings over the years, I've tended to argue that Locke is probably overrated in his influence, but his influence is powerful nevertheless. Although I think ultimately overrated, you can see how his ideas are going to influence the view of the American regime and American politics. He is a social contract theorist, but in the state of nature, the way we are naturally for Locke, we are much better people than Hobbes envisions us as being, and that we are prone to look after our own self-interest. We do get along with each other for the most part, but we have disputes. And where Locke thought we would have most of those disputes is in the area of property, that we would all want to protect our own property. And we really need to move, for Locke's perspective, from a state of nature to political society to form a social contract to protect our property, especially when disputes arise, as they will, Locke believed, over property. But we're basically good. And when we have these disputes, when we move from a state of nature to civil society, to a political system, to a state, it's basically because we need someone to help us arbitrate our disputes, and usually these are over property. For Locke, the purpose of our coming together was to protect life, liberty, and property. And Locke's most famous statement of this is in his second treatise on government, which I would also recommend to you for your leisure and for intellectual stimulation reading. So Locke becomes very influential. We form a limited state for limited purposes and with a higher view of the citizenry. And you can see how Locke might be influential to the American regime. Locke is followed by the third great social contract theorist, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who lived from 1712 to 1778 and is often credited with being the great inspiration behind the French Revolution of 1789. Rousseau, in his second discourse, has this very fascinating statement about the nature of man and humankind. He also has many other writings, but basically his idea is that in our state of nature, as with the other social contract theorists, we are good. I sometimes like to joke that the Rousseauian idea in its rawest form is best represented in that great cinematic classic Blue Lagoon with Brooke Shields on a desert island having a good time. And fortunately for her, a young man appears in the movie. Apparently there are 2 Blue Lagoons, I'm told, by other students who have taken this class. I'm not an expert on the movie, but it's basically a good representation of someone being free. A more classical example from literature would be Robinson Crusoe. And the idea that we're left alone free, we're good, where there's goodness in the individual himself or herself. And it is, in Rousseau's idea, it is society, it is politics, it is the church that has corrupted us, and we have to move beyond that. It's the captivity of the past that imprisons us today. For Rousseau, we must break from that, and we must move from that. And so Rousseau suggests that we can break through from that we can form a social contract. So to get rid of the past and all those things that imprison us, we move from a state of nature where we are good and innocent to civil society and politics. We form a social contract to improve our situation. Now, Rousseau is both exceedingly individualistic and also totalitarian in another sense, because he has this idea of the general will, that when we're freed from the past, we'll see why we all need to come together and we'll work harmoniously. The general will will represent all of our views. And so you can see how the possibility arises that Rousseau has a lot of influence on contemporary democratic thinking. And by democratic, I do not mean the Democratic political party. I mean sort of democratic as participatory democracy. And so Rousseau is a very important social contract theorist. The last theorist that we're going to look at in terms of the nature of the state is a person who follows immediately after Rousseau, and that's Edmund Burke, the great British political thinker who lived from 1729 to 1797. Burke will be in opposition to Rousseau, who he called the mad Socrates. Burke will say that he will dispute this social contract theory of politics and society, and he will say that we're part of an eternal contract, that we are related to previous generations, and together we benefit from their ideas about politics, their ideas about society, and that the past is a model for how we should engage in politics, how we should build a political system. In tremendous opposition to Rousseau, Burke will say that any kind of revolution, any kind of dramatic political action to overthrow an existing government will make things worse. They will always end up with something that is more difficult and almost impossible to live with when you try to recreate a new political system and do away with everything in the past that you've learned. So Burke stands in very serious opposition to Rousseau. Ladies and gentlemen, in a relatively short period of time, we have surveyed some of the major ideas about the nature of the state. As we go through this semester, we're going to look at some other theories of the state and contemporary ideas and contemporary manifestations, but these form our background for that study. Thank you.